Right, because marginalized filmmakers continue to face systemic economical barriers. So can we have more value-based business models, mission-driven collaborations between filmmakers, but producers also, and distributors? And how can we transform film financing from an obstacle to an opportunity for more equity, for more access, for more representation? I was reading recently, together with my colleagues at the CPH Docs Film Festival, an excellent article on the IDE platform. And I simply decided to invite the authors. That was Multitude Films founder and president Jess Devaney, the independent filmmakers Brett Story, and I also invited Carlos Gutiérrez, the executive director of Cinema Tropical, who is also being part of Distribution Advocates. So the perfect mix, I would say, to discuss this very important question on redistribution and renewal of film financing system. And Maggie Bowman, who is now directing the programming and advocacy section of the International Documentary Association, will be moderating this session. So Maggie, I will let you do the rest now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, AC. Really appreciate you creating the space for this conversation. And thank you to Grace. That global context really sets the stage for what we're going to talk about. I'm Maggie Bowman, a filmmaker, and as AC said, the interim director of programming and advocacy for the International Documentary Association. My pronouns are she and her. And I'm joining you from Chicago, which is the unceded ancestral land of the indigenous Potawatomi people. Depending on where you stand in the world as a documentary maker, the ecosystem you work in, and by ecosystem, I mean the interconnectedness of the filmmaker, protagonist, funder, distributor, exhibitor, audience, etc. That ecosystem is contained within varying degrees of capitalism and commercialism. We make art, we make journalism, we tell stories, and those stories are often commodified in service of keeping a roof over our heads and food in our bellies. The existing ecosystems that carry these stories out into the world serve some makers and audiences very well, but for others, they stand as obstacles ecosystems do to a full, vibrant, and representative expression of our societies. Resources, just as they are in the global context that Grace just described, are divided unequally, and marginalized communities, both in front of and behind the camera, face major challenges in media representation and economic sustainability. So in this session, we want to close our eyes, step outside of those well-worn pathways and power relationships, and imagine something different. We want to imagine different ways of making our work, of being in relationship to capital, and sharing our work with audiences. And I'm very excited to share this panel with three thought leaders who will each offer a provocation on this topic. Brett Story, an award-winning filmmaker and writer based out of Toronto, whose films have screened widely, including here at CPH Docs. She is the director of the recent films The Prison in 12 Landscapes and The Hottest August, and the author of Prison Land. Carlos Gutiérrez is a co-founder and executive director of Cinema Tropical, the New York-based media arts nonprofit that has become the leading presenter of Latin American cinema in the US and is celebrating its 20th anniversary. And Jess Devaney, the founder of Multitude Films, an LGBTQ-led production company that tells stories by and about underrepresented voices. Her latest films include Pray Away, Call Center Blues, and Always in Season, and she co-founded the Queer Producers Collective. Thank you all so much for being here. And Brett, I want to start with you. As a filmmaker, when given the opportunity to think outside of the economic structures that you've seen to date in the filmmaking world, what would you like to see? Or
Thanks, Maggie. I hope there's no glitches on my end. Thanks to CPH Docs for inviting me, and it's just really great to be in conversation with all of you, even though I know we don't have a lot of time to get into these big questions. I was invited here, I think, partly because I am an independent filmmaker who has been, trying to get financing for my projects and also making a living like many people, but also because I wrote this piece at the invitation of the Ford Foundation to try and think about precisely this question. Dreaming big, what kind of infrastructures might we build that offer an alternative to the existing economic structures, which in my experience, like most people, I assume, are entirely structured around pitting artists and operators in competitive structures for resources that are held up as scarce. And I don't actually want to say that they're scarce resources. I mean, we know what the executives of big, media companies and streaming platforms make. So the resources aren't all that scarce, but we're meant to feel like they're scarce. And we're constantly doing this work of trying to get our tiny little piece of a pie, that even when we do get it, even when we win these competitions for a grant or for an opportunity, they prove in too little to actually offer the possibility of making a living and paying the rent. I mean, that's certainly been my experience. Trying to make films, I've never been able to make a living with my films. I've always had to do other kinds of work. So I wrote this piece, and the idea was to try and think about a kind of collaborative documentary studio structure that wasn't just collaborative in the sense, or cooperative in the sense of bringing together a number of different filmmakers who would work together, but also organized financially and legally outside of a kind of the sort of capitalist logic. And so I took inspiration from the history, the rich history in North America of community land trusts, which are something that were particularly championed and fought for by Black farmers in the United States throughout the 60s and 70s. And the argument I make, and I feel this strongly, is that when we're talking about capital intensive endeavors, I mean, filmmaking is different than other practices in that it takes, if you have people, you have to pay for equipment. There's a lot of infrastructure that makes it extremely expensive. You're immediately setting up terms in which only people who have access to independent wealth can sort of participate, right? They're basically paying to participate. And so the idea of the community, the sort of documentary trust, studio trust modeled on the community land trust, was that, we need a sort of ways to organize resources and pool resources so that they exist both independent of the whims of financial bodies like philanthropists or other funders or corporations, but also outside of the individual prerogatives of the few people that happen to be involved. So the idea of a land trust, like a studio trust, is that something is set aside in a perpetuity that pools together resources, as well as has embedded in its structure a set of values and principles that allow and encourage and enable people to not only operate in collaboration with each other, but also take risks in their making. And I think, the last thing I'll say is that the sort of existing financial model tends to not just put us in competition with each other, but all kind of risk averse in our practice, and preclude the kinds of diversity in form, but also diversity of opportunity that has resulted in the kinds of structural racism and sexism that we see, throughout the film industry, certainly the documentary industry.
Thank you so much, Brett. And I do hope, I'd love to get back to that question of how economic and creative practices are in dialogue with each other. And so that there's not just economic benefits, but you're also talking about a way to relate to each other as artists that has creative implications. And I'd love to come back to that. Carlos, as a distributor, you represent another key node in the documentary ecosystem, but you've been actively trying to challenge traditional notions of distribution and exhibition, both in your work at Cinema Tropical, as well as through your involvement with distribution advocates. What are you trying to move towards in your work?
Well, thanks for the invitation. Lots of topics here. I guess in a very basic level, what drives me, what drives Cinema Tropical, we're a not-for-profit organization, and we're dedicated to promoting films from Latin America and the US, as well as the work of US Latinx filmmakers. So I guess in that sense, just a brief contextualization, because I'm based in the US, but I work with films from Latin America and also US Latinx films, and we're talking in a European conference. So I think it's also important to contextualize the local, the national, and transnational, because they interact at the same time. So, but I think it's important to contextualize. So in that sense, I've been very fortunate to have this double vision of working with Latin America, but also seeing how things work in the US. In that sense, so what drives me is that the fact that Latin America for the past 20 years has been able to create a very thriving ecosystem, putting at the center of the equation the filmmakers. And I think this is key. This is key. How can we create more feasible structures where we can place back the filmmakers and the audience at the center of the equation? The problem right now is that we created a very sophisticated system, pretty a monster of a system, where there's the interest of all the intermediaries come first before the filmmakers and the audience. So in that sense, what Cinema Tropical has been doing is trying to serve as a facilitator rather than an intermediary. So for me, that's also key. How do we think ourselves as facilitators, not as intermediaries? In the sense that intermediaries come with their agenda first, and second comes the agendas of the filmmakers and the audience. In that sense, what helps a lot in terms of how we plan and how we work at Cinema Tropical is also rethinking that traditional model of production, distribution, exhibition, which is a completely capitalist equation. So for us, it's more useful to think what the work we do in terms of distribution and exhibition, but more in terms of basic communication. Who's the sender? What's the message? Who's the recipient? The transmission, and the feedback. I think for us, that's a more equitable model and a more reliable model of connecting this great work with the audiences. And in that sense, I think it's important to think it's not about reinventing the wheel. It's making case studies of models that have worked. So in that sense, I think Latin America has created a really vibrant model where the creativity of the filmmakers is at the center. So they have different access to different sources of funding. I mean, of course, it's not great of money, but they can grab from private, from public, from local, from international funding, and that allows for them to push the envelope and take risks, which I think is the opposite of what's happening in the U.S. Money is so limited. There's so much competition that filmmakers are. It's for filmmaker to take a risk because the risk of failure. The risk of failure is so big, and the possibility of making a second film is very difficult. And just to end up, my participation here, what I think Latin America has been great also is separating the production problem from the distribution and exhibition. Distribution and exhibition, because of commercialization, is so difficult, but this access to numerous sources of funding has enabled filmmakers, 30-year filmmakers, 40-year filmmakers, to make 4, 5, 6 films, regardless of what happens to those films. But I think it's a better problem to having great content, having great films, and then trying to find an audience, rather the opposite, rather trying to start from scratch how to create good films.
Thank you. I find the simplicity of that communication model very appealing. What is who is the sender? What is the message? Who is the recipient? And I think it's a really helpful way of focusing us on the filmmaker and the audience. Jess, you co-founded a production company whose mission is to amplify the voices of underrepresented makers, the makers who have not historically benefited from the existing ecosystem, power structure, and resource allocation. what tools do you use towards that mission? Do you modify existing financial tools, or do you create new ones?
Thank you, Maggie and Brett and Carlos. It's just a pleasure to be a part of this conversation. So our team at Multitude produces political documentaries by and about underrepresented voices, and we dedicate a large portion, the majority of our slate, to emerging underrepresented directors. And because of that, we finance the majority of our films independently through a hybrid model of grants and equity investment. And in recent years, through a couple of kind of high ticket sales, there's been a perception of particular tension between independent documentary, philanthropic resourcing, and sort of the corporate and commercial interests of the market. And I think something that kind of hangs in the middle there is the question around equity investment. And I also just want to take a step back and note that our model is very U.S. centric and focused in the U.S. market, and less relies on kind of international co-productions and things. So just to acknowledge that, particularly given the context of this conversation. So with emerging underrepresented directors, pre-sales, commissions, things like this are really few and far between. And so the model of independent financing is both a necessity and a strategic decision, where the financial independence can enable both creative and political freedom. It favors fair compensation, and it also protects authorship to make sure that the right people are helming a story creatively, and that there's autonomy in the decision making. So this tension between kind of the idea of philanthropic support in relationship to equity investment in the field is a really interesting question in terms of how can we ensure that the goals of the philanthropic donors, continue and are supported throughout the trajectory of production and distribution. And I think one of the things that we've been trying to at Multitude really offer is a way that a model that kind of counters the idea that these two modes of financing are in tension, and actually can show how they're offsetting the risk of the other. And for sure, filmmakers would be in better positions if we were in an industry that had much more philanthropic support, allowing for much more independence. But until we're there, the sort of independent equity investment model combined with the philanthropic resources allows us to raise budgets that make films that can thrive in the market and build the careers of emerging actors. And it's also particularly a way to kind of work in counter or opposition to the obstacles that are in place to keep our voices marginalized.
Thank you. It's I think that the equity investing model, particularly in the US documentary context, it's new enough that, in the documentary space, that makers are really getting used to it and trying to wrap their heads around whether or not it can be a or a weakness and so forth. So really appreciate you sort of framing it in that light. We just have, a few minutes for discussion here before we go to the audience and take some questions. But I do want to go back to that question of what is the relationship here between the kind of economic structure of a production and making a film and the creative process. And Brett, I was just struck when you and I talked yesterday that your desire to work in a collective space has economic goals, but also creative and collaborative goals. So there's an interplay in all three of you between these two aspects, and I'd love to hear you speak to that.
Yeah, thanks. And I think not just those two aspects, the question of like what kinds of work can be made, but also what ways of making are possible. And then also the question, like that's absolutely related to who gets an opportunity to make work and have that work meet a public, right? So these questions that we're having, hopefully everywhere right now around diversity and equity and equality in the landscape, I think are indivisible from the question of how do we pay our rent and pay our daycare fees and make work that takes risks. So, I'm a filmmaker who makes, what gets called formally unconventional work. And that is politically committed. And I've found it extremely hard to make this work because the work is, by sort of definition, trying to be courageous in its point of view, but also in its form and aesthetic strategies, and the sort of the very structures of a kind of capitalist competitive economy, regardless of whether that includes some amount of state funding or equity structures. You're still in this sort of competition for, again, what gets posed as scarce resources, means that it creates this sort of mentality. I mean, I felt it myself of trying to figure out how to play the game and figure out the conventions in order to be given the opportunity to even finance a project or access the resource necessary to make a project. And so I just think that when we're talking about ecosystem, we need to talk also about what kind of work can be made under these kinds of conditions. And if we want to get away from a kind of monoculture of one type of film with a certain kind of message or certain way of expressing a message, then this sort of question of how we organize the resources and distribute the resources is central to that. Sorry, and I have a toddler who's crying in the background, and I apologize.
Thank you. Carlos, how about in your work, this, because you talked about this artist-centric approach in Latin America, where do the creative and economic approaches come into, how do they intersect with each other from your perspective?
Sure. I just want to also add to what Brett was saying. I totally agree. But I think also there's an important element to it because there's already great work being produced. So for us, the problem we face a lot is validation. That a lot of the most interesting work right now in the world is not being fully validated, or is not even validated at all through the film festivals, and that lack of validation hinders the possibility for the films to get seen, to get any distribution. So a lot of the type of work we do is finding validations and talking about economics and talking about how to rethink the model. A lot of the problem is rethinking the idea of impact. Impact has become such a key word in the documentary world, but there's a lot of work. There's a lot of amazing films that are not being validated, but because our film colleagues, they don't see the importance, the relevance, because there's also tied to certain metrics, certain neoliberal metrics about what's impactful. So in that sense, it's re-challenging also how we're validating the films and also trying to be very transparent in how we're validating. So a lot of the work we do, and I think it's key, is diversifying the modes of validating the films, and sometimes that means also taking the films out of the film world, because there's a lot of interest in the films, but sometimes the film world can be so self-centered and so tied to certain tropes that, in that sense, doesn't allow for discovering or allowing more challenging work to be seen.
Thank you. Oh, and here we have a visitor. Welcome. Jess, I think that the idea of equity financing can feel intimidating for folks because access to capital is something that, for people who have had various structural barriers such as racism and sexism and ableism and classism. These are, that just capital feels very far away. So what is the process when you try, you're seeing this as a real tool of empowerment to access equity financing. And I'm just curious how you help people who have not always had that kind of access to capital think about going after it and embracing it.
Yeah, thank you for raising that and also bringing class into the conversation. I think that's something that we really need to be talking a lot more about in our industry, both in terms of how based on our class background or current kind of class, I'll even say presentation, because there are a lot of ways that we can erase class in like the art industries. And one who was, raised poor and working class, with most of my childhood with a single mom, who's a hairdresser. A lot of the language around this was foreign and intimidating and took a while to get into. And I think it was really through a lot of more political theory and then also really movement work of understanding how values aligned people with resources, artists and movement leaders can work within an ecosystem with shared values around representation, dismantling oppression and hierarchy, and that we're all bringing different and equal resources to that. And it was really, I also want to acknowledge my producing partner, Anya Rouse, who has been really influential in my own thinking around this over time. But I think it also relates to what Carlos was just saying about gatekeepers and validators and moving outside of the film space. I think movement leaders' roles in valuing and validating work with political analysis, even if it doesn't have kind of the triumphalist ending that can be so popular within like the more corporate or commercial side of our industry, is really important. But also, the work of the DPA, which you can speak to much more than me in terms of both demystifying things like equity investment terms, waterfalls, how the mechanisms of this stuff work to empower filmmakers to advocate for terms that are fair and serve the values of their project is a really huge resource in an industry where a lot of this has been opaque, and there can be a real lack of transparency unless we're open to talking about this stuff with each other. And we're open to kind of peer training so that we can gain shared fluency through these barriers. And it's as simple as a lot of the first time directors that we're working with even kind of misunderstanding like what happens if I don't pay back the equity investment. Like, is it like a bank loan? Will my assets be seized? Like really scary questions, which are really understandable and also not at all how investment works in our space.
Thank you. We just have a minute left, but I just wanted to touch on collective action before we wrap. Grace, referenced it in her keynote, and I think it's a very important part of this moment that we're in. Not only sort of do we have the opportunity to create in collective spaces, but to harness the power of our collective action. And I'm, just if anyone wants to offer something about that, what role could collective action play in how we decide to transform our documentary ecosystem? Sorry, that's a huge question, but I just want to make sure we brought that part into this. Does anyone want to address that?
I can say something briefly. I mean, I just think, Jess, I'm really glad you talked about class, and I think, I think when we're recognizing that there's a political economy in which this work is taking place in, I think we can also think about what it then means to think of ourselves as workers. And I think it's really hard, speaking as an artist, as a filmmaker. I think there's a sort of allergy or something I've seen among my peers to sort of considering ourselves as workers. I think part because we do really enjoy our work, and those things are considered like incompatible or something. But what's important about it is to understand that we're providing, I won't use the word content, but the art that we make exists within an economy, and someone's making money off of it. And that means we need to be able to activate our collective power to withhold that work, withhold our labor, in order to get the kinds of concessions that we know would allow redistribution of resources to be possible, and more kinds of makers and making to be possible. So yeah, I'm really actually inspired by historical labor struggles that have made use of traditional tactics and new tactics like strikes, and I would love to have a conversation about how we might think about what those terms might look like within the landscape that we're part of.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we've just run out of time, and I know we've only scratched the surface. So I hope that this was really a series of provocations to hopefully get the audience thinking imaginatively about some solutions, and that we can continue these conversations. So thank you so much to CPH Docs for having us, and thank you to all the panelists for your thoughts. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Maggie. Thanks to everyone.
Thanks to all of you. This was wonderful. We know we cannot finish this kind of discussion. So this is exactly what we wanted, like provocations, new ideas, because you have to take that into your own hands, into your own films, and bring that out and make it happen. So that was already an excellent input here. Thank you so much, Maggie and Jess, Brett, and Carlos.